Bikers mess with the wrong woman at the restaurant. They thought she was just another diner, a quiet woman enjoying her meal at a corner booth. To them, Megan was nothing more than an easy target, someone they could intimidate, humiliate, and maybe have a little fun with. The Black Suns MC had been flexing their muscles across the city, taking whatever they wanted, with no one daring to challenge them. But what they didn't know was that Megan wasn't just any woman. She wasn't some helpless bystander. Under the calm exterior and the quiet way she carried herself, she had a history that would make even the most hardened criminals think twice. Years of undercover work. A past filled with secrets, betrayals, and dangerous people she'd outsmarted at every turn. Tonight, they were going to learn just how wrong they were. What started as an afternoon of biker bravado quickly spirals into something much darker when Megan is forced to fight back against the violent threats of the Black Suns. But what the bikers didn't know was that she wasn't alone. She had a team, a past, and connections far deeper than anyone suspected. When Mike, the ruthless leader of the gang, thinks he's cornered her in a dangerous game of cat and mouse, he quickly realizes that Megan is playing a much bigger game than he could ever imagine. This is the story of how a group of bikers chose the wrong woman to mess with, and how a calculated risk would drag them into a web of criminal power that could tear apart everything they knew. In a city where everyone has secrets, Megan's are darker than anyone could guess, and it won't just be the bikers who pay the price. Before we continue, please like, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The loud roar of motorcycle engines chipped the air outside the diner, rattling the windows and sending a shiver through everyone inside. A group of rough-looking bikers stormed in, leather jackets and tattoos on display. They looked like trouble, dangerous, intimidating, the kind of people you didn't want to mess with. But they didn't know who they were about to pick a fight with. Megan sat alone in a booth in the corner, calmly sipping her iced tea, barely looking up. She had been here many times before, alone, at peace, her favorite spot by the window. She liked the quiet. She liked the simple pleasure of good food and time to think. But today, her routine was about to be interrupted in the most shocking way. One of the bikers, a tall guy with a scar across his cheek, walked up to her booth with a smirk. "This seat taken?" he asked, loud enough for the others to hear, a challenge in his voice. Megan didn't flinch. She simply glanced up at him, her eyes cold and unreadable. "No," she replied, her voice calm, almost too calm. The biker raised an eyebrow, glancing at his friends who had taken over the counter, laughing and making loud jokes. "You sure? We don't mind making it a little more lively around here," he said, his smirk widening. Megan set down her glass and looked him directly in the eye. "I'm sure," she said softly. "But I would suggest you keep your distance." That was all it took. A flicker of annoyance crossed the biker's face. His friends chuckled behind him. He leaned in closer, his voice suddenly low, threatening. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Megan didn't respond immediately. Instead, she calmly picked up her napkin and dabbed her lips. "I think you're not as tough as you think." The room fell silent. The bikers exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of this woman who didn't seem afraid, didn't seem to care. The scared biker stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth to say something, but Megan beat him to it. "Leave now, or you won't like what happens next." The challenge hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Her calm, cold demeanor only seemed to irritate the biker more. His friends grew quieter, watching the scene unfold. And then, without warning, it happened. Megan stood up so suddenly that the biker stumbled back. The force of it was so unexpected, so swift, that no one had time to react. She grabbed the biker by the collar and yanked him towards her, pulling him down so close that they were face to face. The room held its breath, and for a moment, it felt like time stopped. The biker's eyes widened in shock. Before he could even process what was happening, Megan twisted her hand and crack. There was the sharp sound of his arm snapping. The biker screamed in agony, but Megan didn't let go. The others stood frozen, shocked and unable to move. What they didn't realize was that Megan wasn't just some woman in a diner. She wasn't someone you could push around. But the question was, how far was she willing to go? Megan had always been a woman of few words. She didn't like to talk about herself, didn't like to draw attention. Life had taught her how to blend into the background, keep to herself. She'd lived this way for years, keeping to the quiet corners of the world. But that didn't mean she wasn't capable of handling herself when the situation demanded it. She wasn't always like this, though. There was a time when she was just another person trying to survive in the chaotic world, trying to make it through the day without making waves. But things changed. Life had a way of pushing you to the edge, making you stronger than you ever thought possible. It all started when she left her small hometown in Alabama for the big city of Dallas. She had hoped to find a new life, a fresh start, away from the people who never understood her. But it wasn't as simple as she had imagined. The city was harsh, unforgiving. She quickly learned that the only way to get by was to stand tall, not let anyone push her around. Her training had begun when she met someone who knew how to fight, someone who taught her the skills she would need to defend herself. His name was Jake. He wasn't a big guy, but he knew the streets and the ways of the world. He taught her how to protect herself, how to strike when needed, and how to never back down. And now, years later, Megan wasn't just the woman who knew how to defend herself. She was the woman who could take on anyone. She wasn't afraid of bikers, thugs, or anyone who thought they could intimidate her. She had her own way of handling things, her own set of rules. And as the biker's arm cracked in her grip, Megan felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. She wasn't proud of what she was capable of, but she knew what it meant to survive. She released the biker, who fell to the floor, clutching his arm and howling in pain. The room was dead silent. No one moved. Megan stood there, her eyes scanning the bikers around her. "You've made a big mistake," she said, her voice cool, almost bored. Before any of them could respond, the door to the diner slammed open. The sound of more motorcycles roared in louder than before. Megan turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. More bikers. And now she wasn't just dealing with one group. She was about to face an entire gang. The roar of the new motorcycles was deafening as more bikers poured into the diner, the doors swinging open with a heavy thud. Megan stood motionless, her eyes never leaving the first group of bikers as the newcomers entered. They were bigger, meaner, and more determined than the first group. They quickly spread out, taking up positions near the counter, the booths, and the door, cutting off any chance of escape. The room's atmosphere thickened with tension, and the air felt heavier, like something dangerous was about to happen. The biker Megan had just disarmed was still writhing on the floor, clutching his broken arm, his face twisted in pain. His friends glared at Megan, anger boiling in their eyes, but none of them made a move. The new bikers, however, didn't seem as intimidated. The leader of the second group, a massive guy with a thick black beard and a scar across his forehead, locked eyes with Megan. His voice was low, but carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "You're a tough girl, huh?" he said, his words dripping with mockery. "But you really think you can handle all of us?" Megan didn't flinch. "I'm not here to handle anyone," she replied evenly. "I'm here to eat. But you seem to have a problem with that." The man stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. "I don't think you understand what you've done. You just attacked one of us, and that's not something we let slide." He gestured to his friend on the floor, who was now moaning in pain, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. "You don't just walk away from this, you're going to pay." The bikers behind him shifted uneasily, eyeing each other. They could see that Megan wasn't backing down, that she wasn't afraid. That made them nervous. They had dealt with plenty of tough people in their time. But there was something about her calm demeanor that unsettled them. They knew she wasn't some average person who could be intimidated. Megan's eyes flicked to the door behind the bikers, then back to the man in front of her. Her heart rate remained steady. "I'm not looking for trouble. But if you're going to make me one of your problems, I'll finish it." The bearded biker's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he masked it again with a cold glare. He took another step closer to Megan, But before he could say anything more, the diner door flew open with a force that made the bell above it clang loudly. The sound of more engines roared in, drowning out any remaining tension. A third group of bikers rolled in this time. It wasn't just their numbers that mattered. The man at the front of this group, tall and wearing dark sunglasses despite the evening sky, had a reputation. This was the leader of the gang, a man known as Iron Mike. Iron Mike was the kind of man who commanded respect just by walking into a room. He didn't have to speak to get attention. His mere presence caused people to pause and look at him. His cold eyes scanned the room, landing on Megan, and the corners of his mouth twitched upward into a slight smile, as though he found her curiosity amusing. "Looks like we're a bit late to the party," Iron Mike said in a deep, gravelly voice, his eyes moving from Megan to the others. "But from what I'm seeing, it's going to be one hell of a show." The first biker's face turned an angry red. "Mike, this woman just broke Joey's arm. She's out of control." Iron Mike glanced at the biker on the floor, his expression unreadable. "She broke his arm, huh?" he mused. "And you let her?" There was a long pause. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers around him shifted nervously, but Iron Mike's gaze remained fixed on Megan. She met his eyes evenly, not backing down, not showing fear. "You really think you can take on all of us?" Iron Mike asked, stepping closer to her. "Maybe you've got some skill, but you're outnumbered." Megan didn't flinch. "I don't count numbers," she said simply. "I just do what needs to be done." Iron Mike smiled slightly, almost impressed. He didn't get to where he was by backing down, but he respected a fight in the right person. "I like your attitude, but you've got no idea what you're up against." Megan didn't reply. Instead, she stepped back, turning slightly toward the diner's exit. The last thing she wanted was to escalate things even further. She had proven her point, but she didn't know if she could get out without making a scene. Just as she started to move toward the door, Iron Mike raised his hand, signaling his crew to step aside. "Hold up," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, stopping Megan in her tracks. "We're not done here." Without another word, he snapped his fingers, and the back door of the diner slammed open. A dozen more bikers filed in, their heavy boots clomping across the floor. The diner was now swarming with bikers, the space so crowded it was hard to move. Megan's heart began to race, her mind calculating. She knew there was no way out now. Not with the bikers blocking the exits and surrounding her. But she wasn't going to let them control her. Not now, not ever. In the chaos, she spotted something, a small window near the kitchen that was only a few feet from where she stood. It was a tight squeeze, but it was an option. She was about to make her move when, out of nowhere, one of the bikers lunged at her. But it wasn't just any biker. It was the man she'd broken the arm of earlier. His face was twisted in pain and rage, his good arm reaching for her, his fingers just inches from her shoulder. His desperation was palpable. Megan's instincts kicked in. She sidestepped, grabbing his outstretched arm and twisting it with a fluid motion, sending him crashing into the tables behind her. The crash of wood splintering and metal scraping against the floor echoed through the diner. The other bikers froze, staring at the scene, unsure of what to do next. And that was when Iron Mike gave the signal. With a single sharp whistle, his gang moved in. It was happening. The fight for survival had just begun. The air in the diner turned electric, thick with tension. The clatter of overturned tables and chairs echoed as the bikers surged forward, but Megan was already moving. Her body was a blur, shifting gracefully between the chaos as she dodged out of the way of the advancing bikers. Every movement was calculated, precise, like the strike of a predator. Iron Mike's gang had the advantage in numbers, but Megan had something they didn't: experience. She'd fought in worse situations before. She'd faced threats that seemed insurmountable, only to come out on top. This wasn't her first time in a dangerous crowd, and it wouldn't be her last. The first biker reached her, one of Iron Mike's men, his face full of rage. He swung a heavy fist toward her, but Megan ducked just in time, her hands grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back in one smooth motion. She forced him to the ground with a sickening thud, pinning him there for a moment before letting him go. He groaned in pain, trying to scramble to his feet, but Megan was already facing the next opponent. The next biker wasn't so easy. He was larger, bulkier, and he came at her with a wild swing that had the force of a freight train. Megan dodged the punch, but just barely. The air whooshed past her face as his fist grazed her cheek. It was enough to make her back up a few steps, giving him room to advance. He lunged again, but this time Megan was ready. She swept his leg out from under him with a quick move, and he crashed to the floor. He groaned and tried to roll onto his feet, but she was already on top of him, her knee pressing into his chest, forcing him back down. The diner was a battlefield now. Plates, cups, and utensils littered the floor. The bikers yelled, some laughing, some cursing, but it was clear they didn't know how to handle Megan. Iron Mike had been watching it all from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. He hadn't moved, not yet. He was giving his men a chance to prove themselves, to subdue this woman who clearly wasn't like the others. But as he observed her, something in his eyes shifted. "She's good," one of his men said, breathing heavily as he wiped blood from his lip. He'd been the one to try to grab Megan earlier, but she had easily slipped away. "She's too fast." Iron Mike nodded, his eyes narrowing as he watched her throw another biker into a booth. "She's a problem," he muttered. Megan wasn't finished yet. She was aware of how they were watching her, sizing her up, and she knew it wouldn't be long before they figured out that they couldn't just overpower her. She wasn't here to fight. She wasn't here to take down a whole gang. But if they kept coming for her, she wouldn't hesitate to defend herself. Another biker came at her from behind. This one was quick, too quick for her to react in time, but she heard the footsteps just before he grabbed her shoulder. She spun around, slamming her elbow into his gut, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered back, eyes wide in shock, but before he could recover, she delivered a swift kick to his chest, sending him crashing into the counter. The diner was now an absolute war zone. More bikers were on the ground, groaning and clutching their wounds. Some were trying to get back up. Others were too dazed to even move. The rest were just standing there, unsure of what to do next. Megan hadn't just fought them off. She had taken control of the situation. Iron Mike could see it now. She wasn't just tough. She was dangerous. He gritted his teeth, frustration building. "Enough," he finally barked. The remaining bikers froze. Megan didn't let her guard down, but she didn't move either. She knew what was coming. Iron Mike was stepping into the ring himself. Iron Mike pushed his way through the crowd, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. He wasn't a big man, but his presence was undeniable. His eyes locked on Megan's with a steely determination. "You really think you can handle us all?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Megan raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. She was sizing him up, watching his every move, waiting for him to make the first one. This wasn't just any biker. This was Iron Mike, the leader of one of the most notorious gangs around. He wasn't just brawn, he had brains too. And Megan knew that if she was going to get out of this alive, she needed to be smarter than him. Iron Mike lunged at her, fast but deliberate. Megan sidestepped, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back, but he was quicker than she anticipated. He spun out of her grip, bringing his elbow up into her ribs. The sharp pain took her by surprise, but she quickly recovered, using the momentum to shove him back. They'd circled each other now, eyes locked, both waiting for the other to make a mistake. Iron Mike swung again, but Megan was ready. She ducked low just beneath his arm, and then sprang forward, landing a punch to his stomach. He staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps. But this wasn't just a fight. It was a battle of wills. Iron Mike wasn't going to give up easily, and neither was Megan. Suddenly, the door to the diner swung open again, and another figure stepped inside. The room froze. It wasn't another biker. It was a police officer. The man wore a uniform, his badge shining in the dim light of the diner. His hand was on his holster, ready for action, but his gaze moved immediately to Megan, then to the bikers. "You all have 5 seconds to stop whatever this is," the officer said, his voice commanding and firm. The room fell silent. Iron Mike glanced at the officer, his expression unreadable. The other bikers looked around, unsure of what to do. The officer stood his ground, his eyes scanning the room, evaluating the situation. But Megan knew this wouldn't be enough to stop them. The bikers weren't the type to back down because of a badge. If anything, it might just make things worse. The officer was outnumbered. And Megan was running out of time. The silence in the diner stretched for a long moment, thick with the uncertainty of what would happen next. The bikers glanced at each other, weighing their options, and Iron Mike's eyes narrowed as he assessed the officer. Megan, too, was watching carefully, knowing that this new development was both a blessing and a curse. The officer was outnumbered, and although his presence might have calmed the situation down a little, she knew better than to expect that they'd just walk away. The officer's hand was still resting on his holster, but he hadn't drawn his weapon yet. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was trying to defuse the situation, but there was something in the way the bikers were standing that told him they weren't going to back down easily. He wasn't going to make it worse unless he had to. 5 seconds, the officer repeated, his voice more authoritative this time, his gaze flicking to Iron Mike. Iron Mike's expression remained unreadable, but Megan saw the slight twitch in his eye, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his jaw. The tension was building again. She could feel it, like a storm waiting to break. "You've got your 5 seconds, officer," Iron Mike said slowly, his voice dripping with a mix of amusement and danger. "But I don't think you're going to like what happens after that." For a moment, Megan thought the officer might take a step back, that he might call for backup or try to talk his way out of it. But then the officer's posture shifted, his stance widening slightly as he stood his ground. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice steady. "I don't want to see any more trouble. You'll be arrested if you don't leave right now." Megan could see Iron Mike's hands flexing. She knew what was coming next, and she didn't like it. The bikers weren't afraid of the law. They didn't care about the consequences. This wasn't the first time they'd had a run-in with the police, and it wouldn't be the last. And that's when the first biker, the one who had been on the floor with a broken arm, let out a loud, desperate shout. His voice echoed through the diner. "Mike, let's just teach her a lesson. She's not worth the trouble." That was all it took. Iron Mike's face twisted with fury, and without warning he lunged forward, his fists swinging toward the officer. Megan didn't hesitate. She was already moving. She grabbed the officer by the arm and yanked him to the side, narrowly avoiding Iron Mike's punch. The force of it sent Iron Mike crashing into a table, knocking it over. The officer barely kept his footing, his eyes wide with surprise as Megan shoved him behind a booth for cover. "Stay down," she hissed, already on her feet again, her eyes scanning the bikers. Iron Mike growled in frustration as he got to his feet, his eyes locking onto Megan. "You really think you can take me down?" he sneered. "You're just a woman. You don't know what you're dealing with." Megan didn't respond. She didn't have time to talk. There were too many bikers, and she was the only one standing. The officer was down for now, but it was clear he wasn't going to be much help. It was up to her to finish what she had started. Iron Mike, livid, signaled to his gang, "All of you, get her. Take her down." With that, the bikers surged forward, and Megan knew she had seconds before they overwhelmed her. She reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers brushing against the small, cold metal of a keychain. A sharp, compact tool she kept with her in case of emergencies. It wasn't much, but it would buy her time. She tossed the keychain at the floor near the bikers, and the tiny object exploded into a cloud of dust and smoke, filling the air with a sharp scent that momentarily blinded everyone around her. The bikers stumbled back, confused and coughing, and Megan seized the opportunity. She ducked low, darting between two bikers, grabbing the first by the waist and throwing him over her shoulder. His back hit the floor with a loud crash, and he groaned in pain trying to get back up. But Megan was already moving again, kicking another biker's legs out from under him as he tried to grab her from behind. Iron Mike was still recovering from the table crash, but he was pushing forward now, fury in his eyes. "You will pay for this, woman," he shouted. Megan turned to face him, narrowing her eyes. She was tired of playing defense. This needed to end, and it needed to end quickly. She sprinted toward the door, hoping to make it to the kitchen and out the back way. But before she could get halfway across the diner, a biker grabbed her by the wrist. The grip was tight, unrelenting, and she felt her body being pulled back toward the chaos. Without thinking, she used the momentum to twist her body and deliver a hard elbow to the biker's ribs. The grip loosened just enough for her to break free, and she spun around to face him. "Not today," she muttered under her breath, sweeping his legs out from under him and sending him crashing to the floor. Iron Mike had finally cleared the table and was on his feet again. He had seen enough. His voice rang out, commanding and dangerous. "Enough. All of you, get out of the way. I'll deal with her myself." The bikers hesitated for a moment, looking between Iron Mike and Megan. But Iron Mike was the leader, and when he spoke, they listened. Megan's heart raced as she saw him move toward her, his eyes locked on hers with a cold determination. She could see the anger in his stance, the way he carried himself, the way his body was preparing to strike. This was it. She was out of room to run, and now she had to face him head-on. The fight between Megan and Iron Mike wasn't just about strength. It was a battle of experience. He had the size and power, but she had the agility, the speed, and the mind to keep him off balance. This wasn't going to be easy. Iron Mike lunged at her again, faster than she had anticipated. She sidestepped, but he grabbed her by the shoulder and spun her around, slamming her into the counter with a sickening thud. The breath was knocked out of her, but she wasn't done yet. She pushed against the counter, forcing herself upright as Iron Mike's hand wrapped around her neck, tightening with a brutal grip. For a split second, Megan's world went dark. But she wasn't out of options. She had one more trick up her sleeve. She reached for the small knife hidden in her boot. Megan's vision blurred as Iron Mike's grip tightened around her neck. She gasped, her lungs screaming for air, but her mind was clear. The pain was temporary. The situation was not. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and the pressure on her throat threatened to crush her will to fight. But Megan wasn't someone who gave up. Her hands clawed desperately at Iron Mike's thick fingers, trying to pry them off, but his strength was overwhelming. He was a seasoned fighter, used to taking control in these situations, and for a moment it felt like she was losing. But Megan had faced worse, much worse. She wasn't about to let him win. Not like this. With her legs still braced against the counter, she forced herself to shift her weight, her feet planting firmly on the ground. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of the small knife in her boot, hidden just out of reach. Iron Mike was too focused on her, his eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction, to notice her hand moving closer. With a sudden, desperate push, Megan swung her leg out from under her, kicking Iron Mike's knees hard enough to send him stumbling backward. He lost his grip on her throat, and she gasped for air, her body trembling as she inhaled deeply, greedily. Iron Mike growled, staggering back but quickly recovering his stance. He was furious now, his face a mask of rage. He had underestimated her. She could see it in his eyes. He was angry, yes, but now there was something else there. Respect. He was impressed that she'd managed to slip free, but he wouldn't let her get away that easily. Before Megan could make another move, he lunged at her again. This time, she was ready. As Iron Mike's massive arm reached for her, Megan dropped low, twisting her body to the side. She ducked under his arm, letting him fly past her. In one fluid motion, she used the momentum to reach down, pulling the small knife from her boot. The blade was sharp, and the grip felt natural in her hand. But just as she was about to strike, the diner door slammed open once again, causing the entire room to freeze. Megan's eyes flicked to the door, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Another officer. This one was bigger, taller, with a patrol jacket that read Sergeant Ortiz across the back. He stood in the doorway, his hand gripping his service weapon tightly. His voice rang out with authority, sharp and commanding. Everyone stop right now. For a moment, the room was still. Iron Mike paused, his eyes flicking between the officer and Megan. The bikers behind him hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. This was different. This was no longer just a scuffle between a lone woman and a gang. The law had arrived, and the tension in the air shifted slightly. But Megan knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Iron Mike, ever the leader, recovered quickly. His posture straightened and his eyes never left the officer. "What's this, huh? The cavalry's here." His voice was laced with derision. "You really think one cop can stop us?" Sergeant Ortiz didn't flinch. He stepped into the diner, his eyes scanning the scene. The mess of overturned chairs, broken glass, and fallen bikers was enough to tell him everything he needed to know. "I don't need to stop all of you," Ortiz said calmly. "I just need to stop you." His eyes locked onto Iron Mike, and for a moment, the tension between the two men was palpable. Ortiz was used to dealing with situations like this, but he was also aware that he couldn't take down Iron Mike's whole gang by himself. He wasn't foolish enough to think he could arrest them all on the spot without backup. Megan felt a surge of relief. Backup was on the way. She could feel the shift in the room. The bikers were starting to second-guess themselves. But just as she thought things might calm down, Iron Mike took a single step forward, his eyes narrowing, and he growled low. "You made a mistake, cop. Big mistake." Without warning, he swung his fist at Sergeant Ortiz. The officer barely had time to react, raising his forearm to block the punch. The force of Iron Mike's blow sent Ortiz stumbling back, but he didn't fall. Megan's pulse raced. She had to act now. She dove toward Iron Mike, her knife still gripped tightly in her hand. She aimed for his side, but before she could get close enough, one of the bikers grabbed her from behind, pulling her back with a grunt. "Get off of me." Megan spat, her voice full of fury. She slammed her elbow into the biker's stomach, breaking his hold, and spun around to face him. Ortiz, still struggling with Iron Mike, shouted to Megan, "Don't engage with him. Help me subdue the rest of them." But it was already too late. Iron Mike had recovered from his stumble and, seeing his gang falling into chaos, roared at his men, "Get her. Take down the cop." In a flash, the remaining bikers surged forward. Megan found herself caught in the middle again, dodging punches, shoves, and kicks as she fought to maintain her ground. She spun, avoiding a right hook, and threw a kick to the chest of one biker, sending him sprawling to the ground. But it wasn't enough to stop them. Ortiz was struggling now. Iron Mike had tackled him to the floor, pinning the officer beneath him with crushing weight. The rest of the gang surrounded them both, trying to keep Ortiz from reaching his radio or weapon. Megan knew they were close to overwhelming the officer, and if that happened, things would get much worse. She needed to get the cop back on his feet, or they were all in serious trouble. Megan dashed toward the fray, dodging another biker's swing, and threw herself onto Iron Mike's back. She wrapped her arms around his neck, trying to choke him out, but he was stronger than she anticipated. He flung her off with ease, and she crashed into the floor, her breath knocked out of her once again. But as she struggled to get up, she saw the flash of red and blue lights outside the diner window. Backup was here. The cavalry was coming. Iron Mike, still on top of Ortiz, turned his head sharply toward the window. His eyes darkened as he realized the situation was about to escalate. He roared at his men, signaling them to move. "Get out of here. Now." Iron Mike shouted, his voice filled with authority. The bikers hesitated, but only for a second. Then, like a pack of wolves retreating, they began to scatter, running toward the back exit and out into the parking lot. Sergeant Ortiz, still on the floor, looked up at Megan as she rushed to help him. "Get up now," he barked, his voice hoarse but urgent. Megan grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet just as the back door slammed shut behind the last biker. Iron Mike and his crew were gone, but the fight wasn't over. Megan stood there, her heart pounding, and turned to face the officer. The battle was won for now, the war wasn't over. Iron Mike and his gang would be back. And next time they wouldn't be so easy to defeat. The diner's front door swung open again, this time slowly, as if someone was testing the air before stepping inside. Megan's pulse quickened, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her side. But it wasn't Iron Mike. It was a group of uniformed officers, and behind them was a tall man in a suit, with a hard look in his eyes. The lead officer, a sharp-looking woman with short, dark hair, stepped forward, her eyes quickly scanning the scene. She was followed by two more officers, both of them holding tasers. Behind them, the man in the suit watched silently, his gaze shifting between Megan and Ortiz. Sergeant Ortiz staggered to his feet, brushing dust and grime from his uniform. His expression was grim as he nodded toward the woman officer. "Detective Harris, glad to see you," he muttered, though there was no warmth in his voice. Detective Harris didn't smile. "We got a call about a fight here," she said, her voice clipped, calm and professional. She looked at the chaos of the diner, the broken tables, the overturned chairs, and the remnants of the bikers' raid. "What happened?" Ortiz glanced at Megan, then back to Harris. "Iron Mike and his gang tried to take this place over. He nodded at Megan, took care of most of them, but they got away before we could stop them." Megan stood still, watching the officers carefully. She had no love for the police, but she could see that Detective Harris wasn't your average officer. She had a presence, an air of competence that made Megan trust her, at least for the moment. "Where'd they go?" Harris asked, her eyes narrowing. Megan stepped forward, still wary but determined to give some answers. "Out the back. They scattered like roaches when the lights came on." She motioned toward the parking lot. "They probably took off, but they won't be gone long. They'll regroup." "Do you have any idea what they wanted?" Harris's voice was sharper now, like she was already thinking ahead. Megan noticed how the detective wasn't just looking at the mess around her. She was sizing up the situation, trying to figure out the next move. Megan shook her head. "Doesn't matter. They'll be back. They always come back." Ortiz's hand went to his radio. "Backup's on the way. We'll need to lock this place down and check for any other threats. They might have left something behind." Detective Harris glanced at the man in the suit, who had been silent up until now. He was tall, with graying hair and a clean-shaven face. His eyes were cold, like a predator scanning for weaknesses. He didn't look like someone who had just walked into a scene like this by accident. There was a calmness about him, but it was the kind of calm that made you uncomfortable. "What's your name?" Harris asked, not unkindly, but with that same professional tone. The man in the suit smiled faintly. "I'm Richard Rick Douglas," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm here to help. I believe I'm the one you should be talking to about this." Harris didn't flinch at the casual introduction. "Help? With what exactly?" Megan watched as Rick took a few steps toward them, his gaze sharp, calculating. "Iron Mike isn't just a local thug. He's part of something bigger. We've been tracking his gang for months. It's not just about street fights and bar brawls. He's connected to some dangerous people." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "And I think you both," he gestured between Harris and Ortiz, "have no idea just how deep this goes." Megan didn't trust him. Something about the way he spoke, like he already knew more than he was letting on, set her on edge. She had dealt with people like Rick before, people who played the game from the shadows, manipulating things behind the scenes for their own benefit. "Bigger than a biker gang?" Ortiz scoffed, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "How deep does it go?" Rick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Megan, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to decide whether she could be trusted. Then he spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. "Iron Mike's gang has been a front for an underground network. Drug smuggling, racketeering, you name it. It's a larger operation that extends beyond the city, and if you don't take it down now, it could spread like wildfire." Megan's stomach dropped. She'd known Iron Mike was trouble, but hearing this, it was worse than she'd imagined. She looked back at Ortiz, who was frowning deeply. "We've been trying to infiltrate them for a while," Rick continued, his eyes never leaving Megan's. "And we need someone on the inside, someone who can get close to Mike." Megan bristled at the suggestion. She knew exactly where this was going. "You want me to help you?" "No thanks. I didn't sign up for this." Rick's expression softened, but there was something calculating about it. "I didn't think you would. But think about it. Iron Mike knows you now. He's seen what you can do. If you walk away, he'll hunt you down. They'll come for you. And if you don't have the right people watching your back, you won't last long." Megan's eyes narrowed. "So now you're threatening me?" "I'm offering you a choice," Rick said smoothly, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "You help us, and we help you. We can provide you with the resources you need to take down Mike's operation, and in exchange, we'll protect you. We're not asking for a partnership, just cooperation." Megan stood there, her heart pounding. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him to take his offer and walk out the door. But the truth was, she didn't have a choice. Iron Mike wasn't going to forget what had happened tonight. She was marked now, and as much as she hated the idea of working with the police, or anyone, she knew she was in too deep to back out. The whole situation felt like a trap, but it was one she had to step into. She had no way out. "I don't trust you," she said quietly, her eyes still locked on Rick's. "But I don't have a lot of options right now." Rick smiled, as if he knew she'd come to that conclusion. "You'll learn to trust us. And when this is over, you'll be the one to decide what happens to Iron Mike and his operation." Sergeant Ortiz moved over to the radio, signaling for the backup units to start sweeping the area. "We'll need a full lockdown. If Mike's gone, he'll be back soon. We need to be ready." Harris turned back to Megan. "You should come with us. We'll need to question you further about what happened here." Megan nodded stiffly, though she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was far from over. Iron Mike had slipped away for now, but he would return. And when he did, the stakes would be even higher. As the officers moved through the diner, securing the premises, Megan stood at the center of the wreckage, her mind racing. She hadn't signed up to take down a criminal empire. But somehow she found herself tangled in one. And if she was going to survive this, she was going to need more than just a knife in her boot. Megan sat in the back of the unmarked police SUV, staring out the window as the night passed by in a blur. The city's lights flickered past like ghosts, each one reminding her of how far she had fallen into something she never wanted to be a part of. The words Rick Douglas had said still echoed in her mind, twisting in ways she didn't want to think about. "You'll learn to trust us." She didn't want to trust anyone, not after everything that had happened. But right now, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Detective Harris was in the front seat, her hands gripping the wheel, eyes focused on the road ahead. She hadn't said much since they left the diner, and neither had Megan. The tension between them was thick, like a thread stretched too tight. Harris was a professional. Megan could tell that much, but there was something about her, something cold, that made Megan uneasy. Rick sat beside her, silent for the moment, but his presence was ever so imposing. Megan could feel his eyes on her, but she refused to look back. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the passing city streets, willing herself to ignore the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. "Are you planning on staying quiet the whole time?" Rick finally asked, his voice smooth, almost amused. Megan didn't respond at first. She didn't have the energy to play his games. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice low but firm. Rick's lips curled into a half-smile, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. "I want you to make the right choice. I want you to help us bring Mike down. But I also understand if you need time. It's a big decision." Megan didn't know if she hated him more for his calm demeanor or for the fact that she knew he was right. She was caught between two forces: Mike's gang, a brutal criminal network, and the police, who had their own agenda. Neither side cared about her, not really. They only cared about what she could do for them. She had nothing left to lose. Her thoughts drifted to the last few hours, the chaos at the diner, the bikers, the fight. The way the whole situation had escalated so quickly. Iron Mike wasn't just a thug. He was a man with a network, a reach, and that meant she was in deeper than she had ever realized. As the car made a sharp turn, Megan felt the sudden weight of the decision pressing down on her. Her chest tightened as her mind raced through the possibilities, none of which seemed like they'd end well. But she couldn't keep running. Not from Mike. Not from this. She glanced toward the front of the car, meeting Harris's eyes in the rearview mirror. "You don't know what you're getting into," Megan said quietly, her tone more intense than she intended. "Mike won't stop. He'll find us. He'll come for all of you." Harris didn't flinch. "We're ready for him," she replied flatly, then added after a pause, "You don't have to be part of this. But if you want to walk away, there's no turning back. Mike won't let you." Megan looked out the window again, her fingers tapping against her leg. "I know," she muttered. "But I don't have a choice." "Do I?" Rick's voice came again, calm and measured. "You've always had a choice, Megan. You just have to choose the side that'll help you survive." The SUV slowed as they turned into a quiet part of town, a section that Megan didn't recognize. The buildings were older here, their once sturdy frames now worn and cracked from years of neglect. They parked outside a nondescript building, a brick structure with dark windows and a single locked door. No signs, no markings, nothing to suggest what it was. "We're here," Rick said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Megan's heart thudded in her chest as she stepped out of the SUV, the cold night air biting at her skin. She was used to danger, used to being on the edge. But this felt different. She was walking into something much bigger than a street fight. This wasn't just about surviving Mike. This was about getting caught in a war between forces she couldn't control. The building smelled musty, the kind of smell that made Megan's skin crawl. Rick led them inside, and the air grew even heavier, filled with the quiet hum of activity. She could hear murmured voices, the shuffle of feet across the floor. There was a sense of urgency in the air, like everyone was preparing for something. She was just one more piece of the puzzle, a pawn they hoped would fit into their plan. They walked down a long hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. At the end of the hall, a door opened into a small office, cluttered with paperwork, maps, and a few monitors that blinked with images of various locations, likely surveillance footage of Iron Mike's operations. The walls were lined with photos and names, some familiar, others unrecognizable. Rick gestured toward a chair in front of a desk. "Take a seat. We've got work to do." Megan sat down reluctantly, her mind still spinning. As she settled in, Harris stepped to the side, speaking into a radio in a low voice. A few moments later, a man in his 40s, tall with a buzz cut and an intense look, entered the room. His eyes briefly flicked over to Megan before he turned his attention to Rick. "This is Agent Daniels," Rick said. "He's our lead on Mike's operation." Agent Daniels nodded briefly in acknowledgement, his expression unreadable. "We've got some intel on Mike's crew. They've been moving weapons too. It's not just drugs and cash. They're preparing for something big." Megan's brow furrowed. Weapons? That was new information. She thought back to the diner. How quickly things had escalated, how the bikers had been ready to fight. She didn't realize it had been more than just a raid. "What kind of weapons?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniels didn't look at her but glanced over at Rick. "Heavy stuff. Military-grade rifles, explosives. It's a whole network." Rick's voice broke in. "Mike's getting ready for a big move. And we don't know exactly when, but we do know this. He won't stop until he has complete control." Megan's stomach twisted. The stakes were much higher than she had imagined. This wasn't just about a gang terrorizing the streets. It was about an underground army ready to strike. And she was in the middle of it. "We need someone who can get close to Mike, who can get inside his operation," Rick said, his voice low. "That's where you come in." Megan clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I'm not a cop. I don't do this kind of work." Rick didn't seem surprised. "You think I don't know that? But you've already shown you can handle yourself. And I know you've got a reason to want Mike gone. You wouldn't have fought him back at the diner if you didn't." Megan looked at him, her mind working through the mess of thoughts and emotions. She didn't trust Rick or anyone in this room, but he was right about one thing. Mike needed to be taken down, and she needed to find a way out of this, once and for all. "I'll help," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "But if I'm doing this, I'm doing it my way." Rick gave her a small smile. I wouldn't expect anything less. The first few days in the police facility felt like a blur to Megan. She couldn't remember if it was the overwhelming sense of being watched or the constant flood of information she was being given, but the entire thing felt suffocating. The walls of the small, nondescript office felt like they were closing in on her. Despite being surrounded by detectives, agents, and monitors blinking with data, she had never felt more alone. Rick Douglas had made it clear from the start. This was her mission now. She was the only one who had the right connections to Iron Mike. She was the key to bringing him down. Every time she looked at the map pinned to the wall, with Mike's territories marked in red, or the photos of his gang members spread across the table, Megan felt like she was staring at a monster too big to defeat. But she didn't have much of a choice anymore. She wasn't just a pawn in this operation. She was the only card they had left to play. Megan's role was to infiltrate. She was supposed to get inside Mike's inner circle, find out what he was planning, and then feed the police information without him realizing it. Simple, right? At least, that's what they kept telling her. Rick had given her the rundown. Mike wasn't just some brute running a gang. He was the head of a well-organized criminal network that spanned cities, trading in everything from drugs to weapons to human trafficking. This wasn't just about stopping a gang. It was about dismantling an empire. Megan's task was to get close to Mike, to learn his operations from the inside, and to stay alive long enough to do it. And if things went according to plan, she'd have the perfect opportunity to take him down when the time was right. But what she hadn't expected was how quickly she would begin to lose herself in the mission. The first couple of meetings had been straightforward. Rick had arranged a few introductions with people connected to Mike's operations. She had to play her part, act like she was just another biker, just another mercenary trying to get in with the right crowd. It was harder than she'd anticipated. She had to suppress everything about herself, her past, her real motivations, even her instincts. Everything had to be a lie. Every time she walked into a room full of Mike's men, she had to swallow her discomfort, bite her tongue, and push away the part of her that wanted to punch them all in the face. The bikers were rough. Some were clearly dangerous, and yet Megan knew she had to remain calm, collected, and most importantly, useful. And that's what she was, useful. Not a hero. Not someone they'd trust with any real information. Just someone who could do the dirty work and get them what they needed. And they needed someone who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty. Her first real test came when she was invited to a meeting at one of Mike's known spots, a rundown warehouse near the outskirts of town. The place was a fortress. Concrete walls, metal gates, and dozens of armed men posted at every corner. It was hard to imagine that this place had once been a thriving industrial hub. Now it was a breeding ground for the darker side of the criminal world. Megan had been briefed on what to expect, but no amount of preparation could have made her ready for the atmosphere when she walked in. The air was thick with tension, smoke, and the heavy stench of alcohol. Mike's men didn't talk much. They just watched. It was like being surrounded by predators who were waiting for the right moment to strike. Iron Mike wasn't there yet, but she could feel his presence looming. Megan had heard enough about him to know that he wasn't someone to underestimate. He ruled his crew with an iron fist, literally. The stories about his violent temper, the way he handled betrayals and failures with ruthless precision, were enough to make anyone nervous. But Megan had no choice. She was here now, and she had to prove she belonged. She sat at a grimy table with a few of Mike's lower-ranked men. They looked her over, sizing her up, wondering what she was doing there. She did her best to keep her cool, letting her natural confidence shine through, even as the adrenaline pumped in her veins. A few minutes later, the door to the warehouse creaked open, and Iron Mike stepped inside. His presence was immediately felt by everyone in the room. The chatter died down and all eyes turned to him. Megan had been briefed on what Mike looked like. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that had seen far too many fights. He had a scar running down his left cheek, a permanent reminder of his violent past. He walked in like he owned the place, the weight of his reputation preceding him. Mike didn't acknowledge anyone immediately. Instead, he walked straight up to the table where Megan was sitting and stopped just a few feet from her. His gaze was piercing, as if he were already deciding whether she was worth his time. The room was dead silent. "So you're the one they sent?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "The new recruit?" Megan held his gaze, forcing herself to remain calm despite the nervous energy buzzing in her chest. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. "You got a problem with that?" Mike didn't smile, but his eyes glinted with something almost approving. "You got guts. I like that. Let's see if you've got more than just that." He nodded toward one of the men standing by the door. The man quickly stepped forward and handed Mike a large envelope filled with cash. "Business as usual," the man muttered. Mike tossed the envelope to Megan. "Take that. You've earned it." Megan caught it, her fingers brushing the cash inside. The amount was more than she had ever handled in one go. It wasn't just a test. It was a signal that she was in. She had passed the first hurdle. But there was more to this game than money. "Mike's always watching, always listening," one of the men at the table said in a low voice. "You mess up, and you're done. Simple as that." Megan nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. This wasn't just about doing the job. It was about keeping her head down, making the right moves, and staying alive long enough to make a real difference. As the meeting dragged on, Mike gave a few orders, discussed the next shipment of weapons, and then excused himself, leaving the room just as quietly as he had entered. But Megan wasn't fooled. His presence lingered in the air long after he left. Everyone in the room, from the lowest of the low to the men closest to Mike, was walking on eggshells. Megan stayed a little longer, listening in on conversations, picking up whatever tidbits she could. There was talk of a big shipment arriving soon, something that could change the balance of power in the city. She didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but she knew it would be her chance to dig deeper. She had made it this far, but now the real work began. She had to keep pretending to be one of them, even as the web around her grew tighter and tighter. Later that night, after she left the warehouse, Megan sat in her car staring at the dashboard. Her mind was racing. She had done everything they asked of her so far. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. She was getting too close to Mike, too involved with people she didn't trust. And worse, the longer she stayed in this world, the harder it would be to leave. Could she pull this off? Could she keep her cover long enough to bring Mike down without losing herself? But Megan knew the truth. She wasn't just in danger of losing herself. She was in danger of becoming exactly what she was pretending to be. Megan's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the empty road ahead. The weight of the envelope sitting on the passenger seat was almost unbearable. It wasn't just the money. It was what it represented. She was in now deeper than ever. The reality of her situation hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just pretending to be part of Mike's world anymore. She was part of it. The streetlights blurred past her as she drove back to the safe house the police had set up for her. It was a small, run-down apartment on the edge of town, furnished with the bare essentials. Megan hated being there. The walls felt like they were closing in on her every time she walked through the door. But it was the only place she could let her guard down, at least a little. When she arrived, she locked the door behind her, double-checking the deadbolt out of habit. She tossed the envelope onto the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might explode. The money was blood money, she knew that much. It wasn't hers, and she didn't want it. But for now, it was part of the game she had to play. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at the screen. It was Rick. She debated ignoring it, but she knew he'd just keep calling until she answered. With a sigh, she picked up the phone. "What?" she said flatly. "Nice to hear your voice, too," Rick replied, his tone light, but edged with something sharper. "How'd it go?" Megan leaned against the counter, rubbing her temple. "I'm in." He bought it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Rick's voice came through, quieter now, more serious. "Good. That's a start. Did you get anything useful?" Megan thought back to the warehouse, to the murmurs of a shipment, to the heavy air of anticipation among Mike's men. "They're planning something big," she said. "A shipment. Weapons, I think. But I don't have the details yet. We'll need those details, Rick said firmly. Mike's been quiet for too long. If he's making a move, it's going to be big. Megan's jaw tightened. She hated how easily Rick slipped into his role, how calmly he talked about this like it was just another day at the office. For her, this was life and death. I'll do what I can, she said. But if you think I'm going to risk my life just to get your intel, you're wrong. Rick didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was softer. You're not alone in this, Megan. We've got your back. She scoffed. Sure you do. The call ended and Megan tossed the phone onto the counter. She didn't believe Rick for a second. The truth was, she was alone. She had always been alone. And now, more than ever, she had to rely on herself to get through this. The next day, Megan found herself back at the diner where it had all started. She didn't know why she'd come back. Maybe it was some kind of twisted attempt to feel normal again, to remind herself of the life she'd had before Mike and Rick and the police dragged her into this mess. But as she sat in her usual booth, sipping her iced tea, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her instincts kicked in, and she scanned the room casually. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual crowd was there. The older couple by the window. The trucker nursing a coffee at the counter. But something felt off. And then she saw him. A man sitting alone at a table near the door, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. He was dressed like he didn't want to be noticed. Plain jeans, a black hoodie. But the way he sat, the way he barely touched the coffee in front of him, screamed that he didn't belong. Megan's heart raced. She didn't know if he was one of Mike's men or someone sent by Rick to keep tabs on her. But either way, she didn't like it. She had been careful and taken every precaution to make sure she wasn't being followed. But somehow someone had found her. She finished her drink quickly, tossing a few bills onto the table, and walked out of the diner, keeping her pace steady. She could feel the man's eyes on her as she stepped outside, but she didn't look back. Instead, she headed down the street, turning the corner and slipping into a narrow alley. Megan pressed her back against the wall, her breath coming in short bursts as she listened. Footsteps. They were faint but steady, growing louder as they approached the alley. She clenched her fists, her body tense, ready to fight if she had to. The footsteps stopped. Megan waited, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, slowly, the man appeared at the entrance to the alley. He didn't look surprised to see her there. In fact, he almost looked amused. You've got good instincts, he said, his voice calm and even. That's going to keep you alive. Megan didn't move. Who are you? The man pushed his sunglasses up onto his head, revealing sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. A friend, he said. Or at least I could be. I don't need friends, Megan shot back. The man smirked. Maybe not, but you do need allies. Megan narrowed her eyes. You work for Mike? The man shook his head. Not exactly, but I know a lot about him, and I know a lot about you too. Her blood ran cold. What do you want? I want to help you, he said simply. Mike's dangerous. You're in over your head, but I've got information that could tip the scales in your favor. All I need is for you to trust me. Megan snorted. Trust? That's a tall order. The man shrugged. Suit yourself. But when things start to go south, and they will, you're going to wish you'd taken my help. Before Megan could respond, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded street. She stood there for a long moment, her mind racing. Who was he? And why did he seem to know so much about her? Megan didn't have time for more questions. She had a mission to focus on. But deep down, she knew this encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous. The next few days felt like a fever dream. Megan couldn't shake the memory of the man in the alley, the way he had spoken to her like he knew everything. He wasn't just some stranger. He was someone who had been watching her, following her, and waiting for the right moment to step into her life. She couldn't afford distractions, not right now. She was too deep in Mike's world, and there was no room for mistakes. But the more she thought about it, the harder it became to ignore him. He had been right about one thing. Things were about to go south. She could feel it. The tension in Mike's operation had been growing, and the whispers of a big shipment had turned into more than just idle chatter. They were preparing for something major. A few more days, maybe a week at most, and Megan knew Mike would make his move. But what if the mysterious man in the alley wasn't just some rogue operator? What if he could actually help her? She kept her focus on the mission, just as Rick had instructed her. Every day, she spent more time with Mike's crew, getting closer to the men who worked for them, learning their routines, earning their trust. But every night, when she returned to the safe house, her mind kept drifting back to the alley and the stranger's words. The pressure was building. The walls were closing in. One evening, as she sat at a rundown bar with a few of Mike's men, guys she had gotten to know in the last couple of weeks, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Rick. She quickly checked it, but all it said was, "We need to talk." Megan didn't hesitate. She finished her drink, stood up, and slipped out of the bar, keeping her head low. The last thing she needed was to draw attention. She didn't want anyone to know she was still working with the police. That would be her death sentence, plain and simple. She drove to the small, nondescript building where she'd met Rick and the other officers before. When she arrived, she was relieved to see that the place was dark, deserted, and quiet. Rick was waiting for her in the lobby, his expression unreadable. "Talk to me," Megan said, her voice low, trying to keep her nerves in check. Rick gestured for her to follow him down the hall to a back room. It was small, with nothing in it except a table and a couple of chairs. Rick closed the door behind them and took a seat across from her. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tense. "I thought everything was going smoothly." Rick's eyes flicked to the door before he leaned forward slightly. "It's not," he said quietly. "We've got a problem." Megan's stomach twisted. "What kind of problem?" "Mike's crew, they've been moving faster than we expected." Rick continued, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We know they've got a big shipment coming in, but what we didn't know was the scale of it. This isn't just a few guns and ammo. This is military-grade equipment, explosives, enough to start a small war." Megan's heart skipped a beat. "So why the hell are you just telling me this now?" Rick's face hardened. "We've been trying to get the details, but Mike's been covering his tracks. He's too smart for us. But we've got a lead, a solid one. We need you to go in and get those details before it's too late." Megan leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. This was bigger than she had imagined. She thought she was just infiltrating a small-time operation. But this was something far more dangerous. Mike wasn't just a gang leader. He was a warlord in the making, and she was the one tasked with taking him down. "I'm listening," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing as she processed the information. Rick looked at her, his expression dark. "The shipment's coming in 2 days. We've got a rough idea of the location, but we need someone on the inside to confirm it. If you can get in and find out exactly where they're bringing everything, we can hit them before they move it." Megan's pulse quickened. 2 days. That was all the time she had to get close to Mike, to infiltrate the operation and get the information they needed. She looked down at her hands, her mind racing. "I'm already in deep," she said, almost to herself. "But how do you expect me to pull this off?" Rick leaned forward, his tone more urgent now. "You've already proven you can get in with his crew. You've built the trust. You need to use that to your advantage. And Megan, if you can't get this intel, everything we've done so far is worthless." The weight of his words hit her hard. This wasn't just another mission. This was the turning point. If she failed, there was no going back. And worse, if she made the wrong move, Mike wouldn't just kill her. He'd make her death look like an accident, something no one would question. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady despite the nerves churning in her gut. "But I need more from you. I can't do this alone." Rick raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "What do you mean?" Megan met his gaze, her mind already working. "I need access to the full operation. I need to know everything about Mike's plan, not just the shipment. If I'm going to get close to him, I need leverage." Rick's lips tightened, but after a long moment he nodded. I'll get you what you need. But be careful. Don't go too far. We can't afford to lose you." Megan stood up, her resolve hardening. "I won't let you down." She walked out of the room, her mind already turning over the plan. 2 days. She had to move fast and smart. If she was going to get the intel they needed and stay alive, she couldn't afford to make a mistake. As she stepped outside into the cold night air, Megan's thoughts flickered to the stranger in the alley. Did he know something? Maybe he wasn't just some lone wolf trying to worm his way into her life. Maybe he was right. Maybe she did need an ally. But trusting someone like him, someone who had already been watching her from the shadows, was a dangerous game. But who else can I trust? The next day, she drove to the warehouse again. Her heart raced as she parked in the lot, the familiar tension creeping back into her bones. She wasn't sure what would happen when she walked in, but she knew this was the moment that would make or break everything. As she stepped inside the building, she scanned the room. The men were already gathered, murmuring to one another as they prepared for the shipment. She could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just another regular business day. This was the beginning of something big, something dangerous. Megan walked toward the table, where the crew was standing. They eyed her as she approached, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. A familiar voice cut through the chatter. "You're late." Mike's deep, gravelly voice echoed across the room. Megan turned, and there he was. Iron Mike himself, standing with his arms crossed, glaring at her with those cold, calculating eyes. "I had a lot on my plate," she replied, her voice steady. "But I'm here now." Mike didn't smile. "Good. You've been with us long enough to know how things work. We're about to make a lot of money. But if you mess this up, it'll be the last thing you do." Megan nodded, her pulse quickening. She was in. But now the real game began. The warehouse was alive with activity. The air hummed with a mix of excitement and nerves as the crew prepared for the bait shipment. Megan could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, to blend in like she had so many times before. Her role was clear: stay close to Mike, keep her cool, and find the intel she needed. Mike's men were everywhere, moving crates and checking weapons, their voices a low murmur of urgency. Megan stood at the edge of the room, pretending to inspect a few of the weapons laid out on a table. But her eyes were constantly scanning the room. Mike himself was busy talking to his lieutenants, making plans, giving orders. She couldn't hear everything, but she could see the intensity in his face. Whatever was coming through this shipment was more than just guns and ammo. It was something far bigger. Megan's heart thudded as she glanced around. There were too many people here. Too many eyes watching. This wasn't the time to push for answers. She needed to get closer to Mike, and fast. She took a deep breath and walked toward him, keeping her movements casual. As she neared, Mike turned and caught her eye. "You've got something to say, or are you just here to watch?" he asked, his voice rough, but there was an edge of curiosity in it. Megan didn't flinch. "Just wanted to check in," she said smoothly. "What's the plan?" "You've been keeping everyone on edge today." Mike's eyes narrowed. He studied her for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to trust her with more information. Then, with a grunt, he waved her over to the side, out of earshot of the others. "This shipment's gonna change everything," he said, his voice low. "We're getting our hands on something special this time. It's not just guns or drugs. We're talking military-grade explosives, high-tech gear, stuff that could take down entire cities. It'll put us on the map, you understand." Megan nodded, her mind racing. Explosives, high-tech gear. This was exactly what Rick had warned her about. She had to get more details, but Mike wasn't giving her much. She couldn't afford to push too hard. If she made the wrong move, she could blow her cover. "Sounds like a big deal," she said, trying to sound casual. "How soon do you expect it?" "Soon enough," Mike said, his eyes scanning the room, his attention drifting back to his men. "I'll let you know when it arrives. But don't go getting any funny ideas. You mess up, and you'll regret it." Megan swallowed her frustration. She had to be careful. This was a delicate game, and one wrong move could ruin everything. She stepped back, her mind spinning as she watched Mike turn and walk back to his crew. As the hours passed, the atmosphere grew more electric. The shipment was close. Megan could feel it. She watched every movement, every whisper. She needed one solid piece of information, something concrete that could tell her where the shipment was going and who was involved. But Mike's crew was tight-lipped, and the longer she stayed in the warehouse, the more exposed she felt. Every moment brought her closer to the edge. Then, as the night wore on, something unexpected happened. The door to the warehouse opened, and a few new faces walked in. Megan didn't recognize them, but their presence sent a ripple through the crew. These men were different, dressed in black tactical gear, with serious expressions on their faces. Mike straightened immediately, his posture stiffening as he went to meet them. Megan stayed in the shadows, trying to stay out of sight. Bird instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to wait and watch. Whatever was going on now was important. The new arrivals exchanged a few brief words with Mike, and then he led them over to one of the larger crates in the corner. Megan couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the way the men inspected the crate, their faces hard as they nodded in approval. Megan's gut twisted. What the hell is in that crate? Her eyes stayed fixed on the scene, but just as she was about to move closer, a hand gripped her shoulder from behind. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, ready to fight. But it was only one of Mike's men, Terry, one of the higher-ups. He wasn't the most trustworthy, but he wasn't a complete idiot either. He looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and interest. "You don't need to be getting too close to Mike's business," Terry said quietly, his eyes scanning the room before focusing back on her. "He's got a lot on his plate today." Megan forced herself to smile, playing it cool. "Just curious," she said. "Thought I'd help out." Terry didn't seem convinced. "I don't think Mike would appreciate that," he muttered, then added, "But whatever. Just don't get in the way." He turned and walked off, leaving Megan standing there, her heart still racing. That was too close. She quickly made her way to a quiet corner of the warehouse, trying to calm her nerves. She was getting too cocky, too comfortable. That's how people got caught. She needed to focus, stay sharp, and remember why she was here. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fumbled to pull it out, relieved for the distraction. It was a text from Rick. "We've got the location. Be ready. Don't do anything until we've got eyes on the shipment." Megan's pulse quickened. This was it. The shipment was close, and Rick had the intel she needed. She quickly texted back, "Got it. Wait for my signal." She glanced around the warehouse, her gaze falling once again on Mike and his crew. The new men had taken positions near the crates, keeping an eye on everything. She needed to get in closer, figure out where the shipment was going, and then get the hell out before things went sideways. But then, just as she was about to make her move, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "I knew you'd be here." Megan froze. It was him, the man from the alley, the one who had warned her to trust him. "Are you following me?" she asked, turning slowly to face him. He gave a small, almost amused smile. "You're the one who came here, not me." He was leaning against the wall, arms folded, watching her with those sharp blue eyes. "You know, you really shouldn't be so careless. Mike's men are everywhere. They're starting to catch on." Megan's eyes narrowed. "What do you want from me?" The man shrugged. "You've got a big decision to make. You can keep playing Mike's game, keep pretending to be one of them. Or you can get the information you need and get out before things get any worse. Your choice." Megan felt a knot form in her stomach. She didn't know if she could trust him, but the way he spoke, like he knew everything that was going on, made her hesitate. "I don't need your help," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The man's smile faded. "That's the problem, Megan. You think you're in control, but you're not. You're already too far in, and Mike's not someone you just walk away from. But if you want out, if you want to stop all this before it gets worse, you need to act fast." Megan looked over her shoulder at Mike, then back at the man. She didn't have much time. The shipment was almost here, and she had no idea what kind of weapons or explosives Mike had secured. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice softening. "I told you," he said. I want to help you, but you have to make a choice." Before she could respond, the sound of a truck engine rumbled in the distance. The air in the warehouse seemed to freeze. Mike's men tensed. The shipment was here. Megan's heart pounded in her chest. Everything she had worked for, everything she had risked, was about to come to a head. The rumble of the truck grew louder, its engine echoing through the cavernous space of the warehouse. Megan's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment everything changed. She had spent weeks ingratiating herself with Mike's crew, slowly gathering bits and pieces of intel, working her way into their world. But now, standing on the edge of the action, it felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. The man in the alley had been right. She wasn't in control, not anymore. She glanced at the truck's headlights through the cracked warehouse door, the beams slicing through the night. The doors opened with a low, grinding noise, and a few of Mike's men hurried to unload the cargo. Her heart raced and her hands clenched into fists. Every second that passed felt like a countdown, each tick of the clock drawing her closer to the unknown. Mike was already moving, barking orders at his crew. But there was something different in his demeanor tonight, an urgency she hadn't seen before. He was focused, his eyes cold and calculating. She could tell the shipment was different from the others. Bigger, more dangerous. Megan felt a hand on her arm, and she spun around, startled. The man from the alley was standing close, his expression serious. He wasn't smiling now. "You're running out of time," he said in a low voice. "You have to decide. You can get the intel, but you need to move fast. If you wait too long, you'll be just another piece in Mike's game." Megan swallowed hard. Every instinct told her to run, to grab the intel she had and disappear into the shadows. But Rick and the team were relying on her to make the right move. They needed confirmation, a hard location, and specifics about the shipment. She couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip away. "What's your angle?" she asked quietly, trying to read his expression. His blue eyes flickered, a flash of something unreadable crossing his face. "I don't have an angle, Megan. I'm trying to keep you alive. But I can't make your decisions for you. If you want out, you need to take a risk. Otherwise, you're just another pawn in this game." Megan's eyes narrowed. "You're not telling me everything." "I'm telling you enough," he replied. "Now get moving." Before she could argue, the man stepped away and disappeared into the shadows. She didn't have time to question his intentions any further. The truck had stopped, and the men were starting to unload the cargo. It was now or never. If she didn't act, she would lose her chance to make a real difference. She took a deep breath and slid into the crowd, keeping her head down. She moved quickly but cautiously, walking toward the crates being offloaded. Mike was talking to one of his men near the back, and she used the distraction to slip behind one of the large crates. The crew was busy, too busy to notice her as she inched closer to the action. Megan peered around the corner and caught sight of the truck's contents. Several large crates were being stacked against the wall. But it wasn't just weapons. There were crates marked with military symbols, foreign languages, and security warnings. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just a gang operation. Mike had connections, resources, and a level of influence that went far beyond what she had imagined. She needed more information, something concrete. But her heart raced as she realized how vulnerable she was right now. She had to get closer to the main crates, the ones being guarded by Mike's top men. One of the guards turned in her direction, his eyes scanning the warehouse. Megan froze, her breath catching in her throat. She was exposed. But before he could get any closer, a voice shouted from across the room. "Hey, get over here." Mike was calling to his crew. The distraction was enough. The guard turned away, and Megan quickly ducked behind another pile of crates, holding her breath. She couldn't risk getting caught, not now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and Megan jerked it out, trying to keep her hand steady. It was Rick. "Where are you?" "We have eyes on the shipment. We need that intel now." Megan quickly typed back, "Working on it. Almost there." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and started to edge toward the center of the room. She needed to get closer to see the contents of those military crates. If she could confirm the scale of what was being moved, she'd have the leverage she needed. Mike's voice carried across the room, barking orders as his men arranged the crates. They were working quickly, the urgency in his tone unmistakable. It was almost time to move. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. She spun around, her heart thundering in her chest. It was Terry, one of Mike's lieutenants, moving quickly toward her. His eyes locked onto hers, and his lips twisted into a smile. "I thought I told you to stay out of the way," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Megan's mind raced. She could feel the tension in the air, and she knew this could go one of two ways. Either she would bluff her way out or she'd get caught in a lie. "I'm just helping out," she said quickly, forcing a casual tone into her voice. "Wanted to see how things were going." Terry studied her for a moment, his eyes cold. "Aha. Well, Mike's busy. You'd better keep your distance." Megan forced herself to smile, but inside her thoughts were spinning. Terry wasn't buying her story, and if he pressed any harder, she'd be exposed. But before he could respond, there was a sudden commotion near the truck. Mike shouted again, and Terry turned his attention away. Megan saw her chance. Without thinking, she moved quickly, slipping past Terry and toward the crate that seemed to hold the most attention. She crouched low, moving silently, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She needed to know what was inside those crates. She had to know what Mike was planning. She got within a few feet of the crate, the markings on the sides stark and military. There was no mistaking it. This was no ordinary shipment. Her gut churned as she realized the scale of what Mike was involved in. This was bigger than she'd thought. Much bigger. Before she could get any closer, a sharp voice called out, "Hey, what are you doing?" Megan froze. She looked up to see Mike's top lieutenant, a man named Victor, standing only a few feet away. He was staring right at her, suspicion written all over his face. "Hi." Megan's mind raced for an explanation. Think fast. But before she could say anything, the tension in the air thickened. Mike's men were moving quickly, and she realized the shipment was about to be loaded into a transport vehicle. This was her only chance to get the intel she needed. She couldn't afford to waste another second. Mike appeared at her side, his expression hard. "You've been sticking your nose in places it doesn't belong," he said quietly. "I think it's time you left." The words hit her like a punch. She was caught. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. She was in danger, and there was no easy way out. Megan's heart raced as Mike's men began to close in around her, blocking any escape route. She was cornered. The game had changed. And now she would have to make a choice: fight her way out or give up everything she'd worked for. Megan's heart pounded in her chest as Mike's men closed in around her. She was cornered. No way out without drawing attention, and she knew exactly how that would end. There was only one way forward. Without warning, she lunged for the nearest crate, knocking it over with a crash. The loud noise drew everyone's attention, and Mike's men hesitated for just a moment. That was all she needed. She darted toward the far corner of the warehouse, her legs pumping furiously. The sudden burst of movement startled them, and for a brief second, they were caught off guard. She could hear the shouts and the pounding of boots behind her, but she didn't look back. Her phone buzzed again, Rick's message flashing on the screen. "Now's your chance. Make it count." Megan's mind raced. She had no time to lose. She knew the layout of the warehouse, had scouted the escape routes, and now it was time to put it all to use. She veered left, ducking behind another stack of crates, hoping to confuse them. She needed to find a way out before Mike and his men regained control. But as she moved through the dimly lit shadows, she suddenly heard Mike's voice calling out, "Stop her. She's not getting away this time." She could feel her pulse in her ears as she sprinted, her breath ragged. Just when she thought she might make it to the back door, a shadow appeared in front of her, Victor. His eyes locked onto hers, a grim smile on his face. "You're not going anywhere," he growled. Megan skidded to a halt, her mind racing. She didn't have the time or energy to fight him, but she was quick, and she knew how to think on her feet. In one fluid motion, she grabbed a steel rod from the floor and swung it at Victor's chest, knocking him off balance. He staggered back, his hands clutching at his ribs as he growled in pain. Before he could recover, Megan was gone again, running toward the back door, her legs burning. She wasn't looking back anymore. The door was just ahead, and with one final sprint, she shoved it open. The cool night air hit her face like a slap, and for a moment, she felt a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in weeks. But the night wasn't over yet. She could hear the sound of footsteps behind her, heavier now. They were closing in fast. Megan didn't slow down, she couldn't. She was close, so close to escaping this hellhole. Then, out of nowhere, a black SUV appeared, screeching to a halt in front of her. The door flung open, and Rick jumped out, his face tight with urgency. "Get in!" he shouted, grabbing her arm before she could process what was happening. Without hesitation, she slid into the passenger seat, her body still shaking from the adrenaline. The door slammed shut, and Rick gunned the engine. The tires screamed as they sped away from the warehouse, the sound of pursuing vehicles faint in the distance. They didn't speak at first. Megan's mind was racing. Her thoughts were a blur of confusion, fear, and relief. They were out. She was out. But as the city lights flashed past the window, she turned to Rick, her voice steady but urgent. "What's next? I need to know what's in those crates. What Mike is planning." Rick looked at her, his eyes grim. He shook his head slowly. "Mike's operation isn't just about weapons or explosives," he said. "It's bigger than that. He's planning something huge, something that could affect the entire country." Megan swallowed hard. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her. "We've got the intel we need," Rick continued, "and we're going to make sure it gets into the right hands. But you're not done yet, Megan. This is only the beginning." She nodded, her mind spinning. Her role wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was in control. She had made it out of the fire, but she wasn't done yet. She was going to take down Mike and his entire operation, no matter the cost. As the SUV sped into the night, Megan knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back. And she wouldn't stop until the job was done.